Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is April 4th, 2012, and my guest is Jeffery Sachs of Columbia University. He's the director of the Earth Institute, and his latest book is The Price of Civilization. Jeff, welcome to EconTalk.
Well, thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Our topic for today is the U.S. economy. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of other areas as well. You argue that we face chronic problems, but our solutions that we've been trying are very temporary. What are the chronic problems that you think face the United States, and what should we be doing about them?
Really, since the early 1980s, we've seen a pretty significant structural change in the U.S. economy, and it's been manifested in changing labor markets, changing patterns of production, changing patterns of trade, changing patterns of finance, and a lot of ecological harms and disasters. And I think that when you sum all of that up, one can see that the U.S., like the whole world indeed, is experiencing a lot of disruption, a lot of very difficult changes in all aspects of our economic and social life, and we've got a lot of undesirable consequences from that. My point is we've not been attending to those long-term changes. We have hardly recognized them in our politics or our policies. And as a result of that, we've ended up in recent years in a pretty deep macroeconomic crisis, high joblessness, a pretty deep social crisis with the very high inequality of income and a shockingly high amount of poverty in the United States. We've ended up with dysfunctional systems in our economy. The healthcare system is really, compared to most other places in the world, not working. Our energy sector, our infrastructure, really are way off course from what we need. So my view is that by failing to understand the deeper dynamics that the world, the U.S., are experiencing, the deeper trends of technology and globalization and environmental change, we've just gotten farther and farther off track, and our political system seems only to understand the 24-hour news cycle, or at best the 2-year election cycle. It doesn't seem to want to focus on these longer-term issues at all.
We only have an hour, so that list of problems that we have was quite lengthy. So let's just take a few of them. What do you think are the most important ones that have been ignored that you think are at least amenable to policy?
I think the overriding change of the last 30 years has been globalization. But globalization has many different aspects to it. Of course, the world has really come together into one integrated, interconnected system of production, trade, finance, and technology. The introduction of China into the world economy has been probably the single most transformative aspect. But globalization has both enabled and been enabled by the information revolution. And so that has allowed jobs to shift across sectors and across type and across countries. We have a radically changed division of labor within and between economies. The growth of the world economy as a whole that's been made possible by this and by the change of policies has also put huge strains not only on particular sectors of the economy and on income distribution, but on the global environment, because China is so large and the rise of the emerging economies is so rapid and so significant that we also have planetary scale ecological challenges as well. So I would, in a way, try to maybe a little bit oversimplify it by saying that a fundamental driver is a world economy that at one level has done quite well over 30 years, quite significant economic growth. But the integration of the world economy has meant huge changes in the nature of jobs, technology, and environmental problems. And again, those are the ones that we need to attend to. What we've ended up with is an economy that no longer sustains a middle class, that has huge inequalities between rich and poor, and that hasn't begun to face up to some very, very deep ecological challenges which hit us the hard way in these superstorms like Superstorm Sandy last November, or the massive drought that has been hitting the United States in the recent years and doing a great damage to the U.S. food supply and the global food supply.
Well, let's stop. I want to stop you there because I want to get back to the economy. But you've emphasized a couple of times the ecological issue, and I want to get to that. On the food issue, it seems to me, and I'm happy to hear a different perspective, that the subsidies to the agricultural sector in the United States, particularly the increased encouragement of corn and the production of ethanol, has pushed up prices of many related commodities. That's one side of the commodity price issue. The other side, of course, is the demand side from growth from China and India and elsewhere, which has pushed up prices of oil alongside geopolitical events. So it's very hard to disentangle those. But it seems to me that we don't have any kind of food crisis in the United States other than the fact that we have privileged one product in such a distortionary way with very little environmental return. Do you disagree with that?
Well, no, I agree with both your points. The ethanol subsidies are absolutely crazy, except from the political economy point of view. The rising world demand for feed grains and food grains, especially because of China's growth, is a major factor. But on the supply side globally and in the U.S., we've had an increasingly erratic supply of both the feed and the food grains. Not only the diversion into biofuels, which make no sense, as you rightly point out, but also more and more shocks. Last year, because of this mega drought, we lost something around a fifth of the soybean production, something comparable in our maize production. We're a central part of the total world food and feed grain system. And so that was a major shock. In recent years, there have been significant droughts in China, which did a great damage to their domestic production, forced them big time into the international markets. There were significant crop failures in Russia and Ukraine. And so what we're seeing is three phenomena, and I think you named two of them very well. One is a useless diversion of very valuable arable land into the wrong things, both in the U.S. and Europe, largely driven by lobbies. Second is a rising world demand for every variety of agricultural, and I would add fisheries outputs. But third is an ecological constraint on the supply side. On the fishery side, we've really topped out the extraction from the oceans and done great damage to a lot of fisheries. On the terrestrial side, we have a tremendous instability of the feed and food grain supplies right now in a lot of the staple regions because of this phenomenon of increasing variability, big heat waves, droughts, floods in a lot of places, Australia being increasingly destabilized as well. And so I think it's a combination of all of these factors, but they're all significant and they're all playing a role. And the manifestation of it most directly is very high real prices of these commodities, and of course high volatility as well. But I think both the mean and the variance, the high average prices that we now face, and this very high volatility in recent years are reflections of these phenomena.
Yeah, the only other point I would make, and obviously we could spend the whole time on this, is that I'm not a deep student of climate change, but I have noticed that there is murmuring about the last 10 or 15 years have not shown much global warming. And this seems surprising in light of incredible amount of carbon dioxide that's being pumped out of China and elsewhere as the world has gotten more developed.
I think that's not a right observation, Russ.
Which part?
What people... The fact that the last 10 years have not been consistent with the modeling and with the expectations of climate change, there's a lot of silliness in that oft-repeated observation. The last decade has been the warmest decade in instrument history. What is true is that 1998 was exceptionally warm because it was a very strong El Nino year. So a lot of people that play up this, mainly for propaganda reasons, in my view, say, well, look, 1998 was the peak, and then if you draw the line from 1998, you just don't see all that much. But what we do see is that if you strip away this seasonal and interannual phenomenon of the ENSO cycle, the El Nino Southern Oscillation cycle, if you take into account the decadal ocean temperature trends and so forth, what we face right now is very, very clear, and that is a greenhouse gas-driven warming of the planet that is both highly significant, very dangerous, continuing at a rapid rate, and by the best of our ability of scientific inference, very frightening into the future, with a lot of instability likely to arise.
Do you think we have any precision about what the average global temperature will be in, say, 50 years?
I think we have enough reason to believe that the increases will be so significant, and we're running an experiment not on a small patch of the planet, but on the only Earth we have, that we have all the reason to take strong measures now that are in conformity with the very strong knowledge and inferences that we have available.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come back to that toward the end. I would rather focus our time, though, on the economy, because I think...
But it is part of the economy. But let's move on to other issues.
Well, I want to come to the issues you raised about the U.S. And the U.S. workforce and its relationship to the global economy. I want to challenge you and have you expand on a couple of those statements you made earlier. You said the middle class. I forget the exact phrase you used. It was not a cheerful phrase. Is dead, gone, dying, missing, something.
Shrinking.
What'd you say?
I don't know what word I use, but let's go with shrinking for our discussion moment.
What do you mean by that? I don't know what that means. When I look at the economy, and the reason I find your work so interesting is that it's very difficult to disentangle the mediocre recovery we're in now from longer term trends. And there is a temptation to say, well, we're just having a bad recovery. You're saying, no. There's something more serious underlying this problem. There's a sea change that's more than just the last couple of years, suggesting it goes back 2 to 3 decades. What's that sea change that's destroying the middle class? Because I don't see it. I see a sea change for people who have, say, didn't finish high school. I think a person who didn't finish high school today has a very different economic path than 50 years ago or 40 years ago or even 30 years ago. But that's a very specific kind of problem. You're saying something much more systemic.
Well, first, a person who finishes high school but doesn't get a bachelor's degree is the median. for a young man in our society. So we should keep track of what is, what's a small thing and what's a modal phenomenon. For young people aged 25 to 29, bachelor's degree holders constitute about a third of the total. I think it's maybe 36%. That share has not really changed very much for quite a long time. Most of our young people do not get a bachelor's degree.
They attend. More attend, but they don't finish or something.
More attend, and many drop out before they complete the degree. And the labor market experiences that the degree is important. Yeah. The premium on that degree has increased significantly. If you do have a bachelor's degree or above, you're probably doing pretty well in this economy. But that is not the median, and it's far from the norm in our society. If you have a high school diploma or less, life is tough, and in many measures, it's gotten considerably tougher. Every measure that one could cite has its own school of debate of exactly what it means and compositional effects and other things to take away. But I would say that the highlights are that for men in particular, and I think there's a reason for that because men have been more exposed to the forces of globalization than women in the economy, who are mainly in the service sector and more often than not in non-tradable sectors. But for men, the peak median full-time annual earning was in 1973. And one has to acknowledge that by any standard of our business, if you look at that, because our economy's been growing since 1973 pretty significantly and pretty consistently, actually, to see a median earnings of full-time male workers peak 40 years ago is a structural shock, actually. I find it amazing, very counterintuitive and very striking. But that's the case. And if you look at many other measures, every one of them flawed, so you have to take the aggregation of them to get a picture, whether it's wage levels or levels of earnings in various occupations. Basically, for the middle of the income distribution and on down, there's been very little measured progress. I think probably real progress is greater than what's measured, but all of the measured gains are in the top quintile, more or less, and a huge proportion of those are in the top 1%, we know. So we've had a tremendous widening of income inequalities by many measures. Top 1%, Gini coefficients, top 10% over bottom 10%, top 20% over bottom 20%. We've seen a lot of evidence of stagnation of earnings for those with high school or less educational completion. We see that the number of jobs in the current recovery, for example, for those with high school and less, there's been no recovery. There's just been a net job loss that had no rebound. The jobs for college grads has continued to grow, and there was a rebound that was quite significant. So I think this widening of the income inequality is very real. Sometimes the middle class is measured by the proportion of households or workers within some range of the median, plus minus 50% of the median income, for example. And the share of households within that bound has also declined pretty markedly.
But those numbers are very distorted. by demographic changes due to divorce, as the number of households has changed dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years. Household structure's totally been revolutionized because of that increase in divorce rate, the delay in the age of marriage. So I think when you look at those data, you have to be very careful. I want to go back to your.
Didn't I say that?
Not exactly.
Well, I did, and I not only I said that every one of these has their community that debates the fine points, but I also said you have to look at the totality of this evidence, which comes in many, many different directions and from many different kinds of surveys and many different kinds of evidence. And I think in my conclusion, at least, is that the evidence is strong and consistent, that we've had a significant structural change, a widening of income inequality, a very particular effect at the top, and a quite significant effect from the median on down.
Well, the question then is, first of all, I don't think the 1973 peak of male earnings is consistent with, as you point out, there is some growth. Maybe it's not zero. Maybe that really wasn't the peak. I think it's grossly out of line with what we see through all kinds of consumption measures and other ways we could look at it, the way that I think the data are collected. But
except for us, I would just add the following. Look, by the way we actually measure consumption in the national accounts and by the traditional CPI, Consumer Price Index, deflated standards, there you see a peak. What I don't think is right are these consumer price indices. I think the quality of goods, the advances of technology, the fact that we can do things now that literally were not possible 40 years ago, don't get into our quality of goods measurements adequately. So I think there's been progress, but as we actually measure things, no, then it really did peak.
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt.
So that's my point.
I think the question then is, it's true that the top 1% has done very well. Do you believe there is a causal connection between, say, the top 1% success, which has many different components, as we've often remarked on this program? It includes Wall Street executives who I think have been grotesquely subsidized by taxpayer largesse in all kinds of subtle and not so subtle ways. It includes athletes, entertainers, CEOs of large companies, executives in large companies that have been very successful and productive, entrepreneurs. That a lot of those people have made the world a better place, and I'm thrilled that they're making a lot more money. It doesn't bother me at all. But there are others I think have taken money from the rest of us. But do you think that change in the top 1% has something to do with the fate of those in the middle and below? And I ask that because although we talk about how hard it is to disentangle trends from temporary changes, when you look at this last recession, we see a massive drop in construction employment, which punishes people with relatively low levels of education. We see a very tough secular trend downward in manufacturing employment due to globalization and productivity change. Those, to me, are the things that matter. Do you think the inequality in and of itself is doing something to the middle and the lower end of the distribution?
Well, I think that you're right to point to globalization and technological change as the main drivers of, actually, I would say, of most of this, even at the top. And I regard those as very significant structural factors that we've not been paying attention to. That's really my point. So I'm in agreement with that. When it comes to the top, they've been big gainers in globalization, but for actually a very interesting variety of reasons. One is that globalization really has been kind to capital in general, whether it's human capital or financial capital, more outlets for investment, a larger global market, having high skills or a great brand or a great ability to sing or put a ball in a hoop or in a cup has absolutely been aided by globalization. But so too has the political power of the top absolutely been enhanced by this as well. They can play governments off against each other. There is a race to the bottom in many ways of who you try to attract, who you appeal to in internationally mobile capital. Our own political system is skewed more and more to the interests, the views, the well-being of that group, and that has absolutely been played out in the way our tax system has evolved, in the absolutely grotesque and fulminant tax abuses that have been permitted, and in the fact that Wall Street has run the White House for the last 15, 20 years. And ended up, as Wall Street does when it's allowed to run things, making a huge mess of things. So I think that there's a political economy aspect to the wealth at the top that goes alongside the economic aspects. The economic aspects are that globalization really does favor mobile capital. It really does favor human capital. It has been very tough for those in the middle and at the bottom because of globalization and the competition in the open sector of our economy. And, of course, as you and I both said, technology has been an underlying driver of globalization itself, and also a direct part of the income distribution shifts within the U.S., even aside from globalization. So the summary is I view it as a pretty complicated morass of basic economic factors combined with political economy. But it's added up to a political system which amplifies these differences rather than leans against the wind.
On a cheerier note, you say it's bad for people at the bottom, but of course you've been here. I assume you've been here in the United States. Certainly, the average worker in China, India, and a few other places, they all have a lot of people, have done extraordinarily well over the last 30 years.
I agree with that, and I would add Brazil as another large economy with big gains. You know, the world economy has done quite well in a lot of ways, and I'm a big fan of globalization. I think it has raised living standards and improved well-being. What I'm not a fan of is closing our eyes to the challenges that it leads to as well, and that's really my main point.
Before we leave that, and I want to turn to some more macroeconomic policy issues. Before we leave that, I want to go back to this example of these sectoral changes in manufacturing and housing construction. When people say it used to be that if you finished high school, you led a middle-class life, and that's no longer true, I think that's correct. But my response to that is, well, it used to be in the late 19th century, if you were a blacksmith, you made a good living. And by the early 20th century, was no longer true. Certainly the middle of the 20th century. And people understood that. And they had to go get different skills. And it's certainly true that the manufacturing sector in the United States used to be a very good outlet for people with low levels of formal schooling. That's a sector that's diminishing. Housing has at least declined temporarily, maybe for a long time. What policy changes need to be put in place or have to be put in place, if at all, to let the evolution of the job market deal with these technological changes? What do you recommend?
I think you're making a great point, and I agree with it. When you have underlying structural changes, as we do, you expect you expect changes in response, and then you really have to ask the question: will these take care of themselves? And I think the complication fundamentally comes from the fact that the entire life cycle of human capital, from an early childhood, which gives a chance to a young child, up through formal schooling, up through the costs of higher education, have massive breakdowns, and these are breakdowns that have been acknowledged for decades and decades. I think Milton Friedman was probably as eloquent as anybody about the breakdowns of normal market forces for human capital. What I see happening, Russ, is that we have increasingly become a tract society where a child born into poverty today has a very, very difficult mountain to climb if they're going to get out of poverty, and the evidence is that most don't make it. And there are many factors in that, both within family transmission of human capital, our absolutely insane policy of locking up a whole generation of young minority men, which has led to this incarceration boom, which is breaking our society, especially in African American communities. The great problems of broken schools, gangs, neighborhoods that don't function, kids that by the age of 4 or 5 are not school ready and never catch up. Jim Heckman's evidence on that is extremely powerful, in my view. And then the soaring costs of higher education, which maybe we're going to see a technological breakthrough to get out of with online education. I dearly hope for that. But what we see is a very large cohort of young people responding to the market, trying to get ahead, and falling short. They go to college for a year or two, take on a lot of debt, and then can't make it. And so now we've got $1 trillion of student loans. A huge amount of that is going to go into default. It's going to be very painful for a lot of young people who made a year or two of school but couldn't continue. And we haven't solved this whole life cycle problem of human capital. It used to be easier. Of course, it used to be you weren't aspiring to a $50,000 or $100,000 a year job. You were aspiring to be a trained blacksmith, like you said, and that was an easier road to hoe. But now we have very profound challenges of human capital accumulation because we want to live in a sophisticated, high-income society that requires lots of skills and a healthy upbringing and labor market friendly capacities. And for a significant part of our population, of our young people, it's not happening. And I see that as a huge, probably the biggest investment failure of our time, and also as a social calamity.
Yeah, it's an infrastructure failure that we can both agree on with both how tragic it is and how difficult it seems to be to do anything about it.
I wish we talked about it more in a substantive, honest, evidence-based way than we do. And I wish we took the fact that because of technology and globalization, we've had a problem that's been growing for a long time, that we would actually face up to this. And it's interesting, I take a view on one piece of what you said. Maybe it's a good segue to the macro that is a little bit different from others. We had our housing bubble and collapse, and the housing bubble provided jobs, not huge numbers, but a couple million jobs in construction that went away. And I view that not as a business cycle, but as the last hurrah of trying to do anything to employ people who otherwise weren't going to get employed through easy credit policy. So I view the boom in the housing market basically as the Fed's fairly pathetic response to this deeper structural problem. In other words, we've had a weak labor market for quite a while, and the only way we've been able to address it is by pumping in a lot of money into housing. And of course, that leads to a bubble, and it leads to a collapse, and it's a very short-sighted policy. But the Fed, which is a very short-sighted institution, has simply looked at the labor market, said it's weak, and therefore it's our mandate to lower interest rates, put the pedal to the floor, pump up liquidity. And so we get these housing bubbles not because of mere accidents or deranged regulation, though that's part of it. We get them in part as a macro response, a policy response to this underlying structural challenge, which we didn't want to discuss. And so the only way we end up discussing it is through monetary policy.
Let's stick with this education issue for another minute, though, because I think it is important, and it's nice. Let's have a few minutes of substance on it. I would just add that the technological revolution in education, which I hope is coming, is going to create, I hope, a lot of inequality in our profession. There are going to be some very successful people who can master that technology, reach a much larger group of people, make a lot more money, and there are going to be a lot of academics who are going to have trouble making a living, which probably is for the best. We'll have to, those of us who can't reach large audiences will have to find something more productive to do.
Well, we're going to be like the music industry very soon,
exactly.
because it's exactly what's happened there as well. A few bands make it, and lots of others have their music heard, but they don't earn much of an income.
But for people who love music or who are intellectually curious, it's a great time to be alive. So
I think that's right, and I think for education, we can have a boom of access, but it is going to be pretty disruptive.
So let's talk though for a minute about that education issue with the world we're in now. Before there are these changes we hope are coming, it's the world we're stuck with at least for some time, especially at the K through 12 level. I live in a suburban Maryland town with phenomenal public schools. There's a bunch of them out here. Bethesda, Potomac. Schools are great. Public schools are great here. You go into the city, they're awful. And you asked for an evidence-based discussion of this issue. It's hard to do because we have family issues, we have cultural issues, we have teacher quality issues. Very hard to disentangle. And we have a system that's unbelievably inflexible on every dimension. It's still 25 kids, 40 kids, 18 kids sitting at desks doing stuff with the teacher in the front of the room. We don't have an apprentice system. We don't have a technical training system. We have a fantasy that if everybody could just learn science and math and engineering and technology, we'd all be rich. But not everybody can do those things. So my preference, of course, is to get the government out of the business of educating people and let the private sector and voluntary activity do better. I think we do a better job, but I doubt you share that view. So what would be your recommendation for how we evolve or at least move forward from given these challenges?
I think the first thing I would like us to do is to look at some of the international experience more closely, because I think there are a lot of very interesting lessons of success stories that we could benefit from. I'll mention two. One is Germany, of course, which is now rightly famous for standing out, not quite alone, but as part of a Northern European distinctiveness of low youth unemployment. And they have a tradition, it goes back actually to the Guild Age, of course, of apprenticeships, but they've thought very hard about the school to work transition, starting from what should schools do, what kind of skills are needed, what is a true vocational skill track for skilled craftsmen, which is still very much a German tradition. And then they have public subsidies to enable companies to take on very raw early apprentices, and many of those apprenticeships, which are part of a formal program, then turn into long-term jobs within that company itself, and others just have given the ground-level experience to young people to understand what the labor market is. So to my mind, that kind of active labor market policy is smart, it's complicated, and it's not what we have. We have a kind of an industrial machine, which probably worked in the industrial age, where you churn out kids to 10th grade or 12th grade, and then there was a market for them. Yeah. And that's not working now. The second, I think, is very important is Finland. And a wonderful book that I recommend is called Finnish Lessons, about Finland's kind of self-realization that they were at the top of the world's charts on these PISA international comparative standards tests. And they don't even test there. So they, went into their own internal analysis. What did we do to get to the top of these standardized results when we don't even have a culture of testing? And the point there, which is almost at the other end of the extreme here, and I don't want to oversimplify this, but I think it is at the core, is that Finland, as a homogeneous society with a tradition of social, socioeconomic, ethnic, and religious homogeneity, has an incredibly strong ethic of equality. And the view, as this educator, who was one of the lead education reformers in Finland, writes in this book, Finnish Lessons, is that the starting point was the idea that every kid in Finland needs a decent start and a decent education. They kind of worked backwards from that fundamental premise into the design of their schools, their school systems. They're strongly unionized, by the way, but the teachers are held in extremely high social repute. They're the esteemed members of the society, but there was a real norm of equality. Now, the United States has absolutely no such norm, and we've ran away from it, especially over the last 40 years. We have the most tracked differences, how rich kids want their kids to be educated, and how, and that's largely in private schools, and how average families in the middle have their kids educated are just completely different things. And so we see that difference, but there's a huge resource difference involved. And I think it's really worth looking at how do kids of the top 1%, what kind of schools do they go to? How much does it cost to educate them, and so forth? What happens for the rest of society is completely different. But then I think there are obviously these very deep social realities in our country, but they're not just fate. They are partly our public response. The African-American community has been devastated, in my view, by the way we have engaged in the so-called war on crime from the late 1960s onward. We've had an epidemic of incarceration unmatched in the entire world. And now we're into the second and the third generation of kids growing up without fathers. And with 2.5 million young people behind bars, it's mind-bogglingly wrong-headed. And it's a big part of the problem, actually, that isn't discussed.
Yeah,
and it's also fueled by the worst incentives imaginable. We have privatized the prisons, and the prisons actually lobby for customers, the customers that the state system gives them. And they're perfectly aware of what great business it is to lock up a kid because he's been caught with a joint, and to keep him behind bars for years. That's business. And so every time we privatize something, we also create a lobby around it. That's part of the political economy. And we ought to think about that side of the problem as well.
We did a podcast with Becky Pettit on that, on many of those issues, which we'll put a link up to. I do think it's more than that. I do think it's, I agree there's some bad political economy there. We have a war on drugs that has been very expensive with very little to show for it other than putting a lot of people in jail.
Nothing to show for it, I would think.
And enriching some police bureaucracies and some other as you say, profiteers, people who make money off this system that's not, I don't think, accomplishing anything. It wouldn't happen otherwise. But there's also family structure issues that go beyond the African American community that are correlated. I don't know what the reason is with low education. There are a lot of people growing up without two parents in the home. We have a culture that says that's no big deal, at least a public culture. Whether that's true or not, I think is the great experiment we've embarked on over the last few decades. That's tangled up with a lot of things we're talking about. But let's move to the macroeconomics, because it's an area that it'd be nice to agree with you on. You've been very critical recently of what you call crude Keynesianism, in particular the evaluation of the stimulus spending of 2009, as well as the significance of deficits and the size of the national debt. And you've taken quite a bit of heat from some people who share some of your ideology overall, but don't like this. So talk about what you mean by crude Keynesianism, why you think it's wrong, and is there a Keynesianism you want to defend that's not so crude?
Well, since I start from the premise that we have deep structural long-term issues, my view of the role of government and public investment and the budget is about providing public goods as I understand them and the things we've been talking about, whether it's infrastructure or skills or R&D for renewable energy to combat climate change. I want the government there to do the things that the private sector doesn't do for all sorts of reasons, and view public economics as our appropriate benchmark for that. Now, of course, we could have a debate about every one of those things. We've discussed some of them, and I take generally a fairly expansive view of what I think government can and should do to address some of these deep structural issues. Where I part company with some, say, government-friendly advocates is that since I take a long-term and structural view of these problems, I don't think that short-term aggregate demand management is really the point of most of what we face. And the 2008 financial crisis was, for me, a kind of epitome of this parting of the paths with a lot of people, because when the bubble burst, I said, well, my view is that the housing bubble itself was a symptom, not a cause. Of course, it was a cause of the immediate cycle, but as I mentioned,
approximate cause.
It was a proximate cause, but it was not a deep cause. I view Alan Greenspan as an endogenous politician to a deeper set of issues, and I viewed the easy money policy of the Fed as an easy, unwise political response to soft labor markets in the early 2000s, soft for deeper reasons that we've been discussing. So pumping up the housing market I viewed as just an endogenous policy response, not a cause in and of itself, not a prime mover of the crisis. But when President Obama came in and Larry Summers became his top advisor and Paul Krugman and others were rallying, they basically took the view in my interpretation, which they don't find very charitable, but I thought that they took the view, let's recreate the bubble. What do we know how to do? Well, we get people employed by construction. We get people employed by putting them back to work on selling consumer products and so forth. I thought it was pretty unimaginative because it didn't ask the question, how did we get to 2008? They just said, well, that's a business cycle, and now that unemployment is high, we have an aggregate demand problem, and let's stimulate the economy and put people back to work. And I was rather shocked, actually, because Obama came in, of course, with one of the great messes of modern times, and the budget deficit, because of the cyclical reasons and the TARP, was already above $1 trillion. And if I were in that position at that point, I would say, my God, I inherited more than $1 trillion flow deficit. We got huge challenges ahead. We got to take some small steps to get this deficit down. We shouldn't do large things because we do need a bit of automatic stabilizer right now, but let's head in the direction of getting this deficit under control. But they did exactly the opposite. They doubled down on the deficit. We don't know the counterfactuals, but maybe raising it from 1.2 trillion to 1.6 trillion, say, in 2009.
And keeping
I
at
was
it.
shocked.
And keeping at it for a few years.
Well, and then every time there was an option to start moving it down until recently, I know the White House view, because I was discussing it with them often, we need another year of stimulus. We need another year of stimulus, another temporary tax cut, another payroll tax cut, an extension of the Bush tax cuts, and so forth, none of which I agreed with because, you know, from my philosophy, I wanted more revenues to fund public goods and at the same time to reduce the deficit because I think that this buildup of debt just builds up lots of problems in the future.
Let's talk about those because, you know, I think go ahead, finish. Go ahead, you can finish. Sorry.
But the crude Keynesian part of it, in addition to what I regard as a misinterpretation of this crisis, just calling it an aggregate demand business cycle, basically, is two other things at least. One is the feeling that macroeconomics is just turning a dial, and fiscal policy has a multiplier on spending on the spending side of 1.5 and on the tax side of 1 or whatever it is, and that's good enough, and those are reliable multipliers, and we can count on them. And I just find that view wholly unpersuasive, both on a theoretical and on an empirical basis. So I didn't believe that those dials were there to turn. The second aspect of the crudeness of the Keynesianism was the constant dismissal of the harms of building up public debt. Okay. And, of course, that continues to this day. But this is part and parcel of Keynes's famous quip, which I don't think even he believed in. It was just too good to pass up, probably, the one that in the long run we're all dead. You know, in the not-so-distant future, we're going to have a massive amount of debt on our books that is going to have to be serviced, and that's going to create its own fiscal challenges. And since I'm so interested in public investment and in public programs to solve problems, I just see that as crowding out things that are going to be important in the future. And, you know, for Paul Krugman to just blithely say, don't worry about it, as the public debt goes from 37% of GDP in 2007 to 75% of GDP today, and on his favorite trajectory would continue to grow into the 80s and 90% of GDP. I said, come on, Paul, we got things we need to do with government revenues other than servicing debt in the future. His that's response, where I view that as quite odd and quite wrong-headed.
Well, I think his response would be, he could say two things. One, or he said two things. Oh, look at Japan. They're way over that, and they're not dying. And number two, interest rates, you hear this all the time. It doesn't make sense to me, but I'll let you respond to it. Interest rates are so low. It's cheap. It's almost free. It's practically free. Why are you worrying about it?
Well, if we were financing a long-term project at very low interest rates on a long-term debt, I think there's probably an argument there for certain kinds of investment programs. But if we're financing our general government budget deficit, taking pains, by the way, through public policy of the Fed to shorten the maturity of the public debt, and at the same time, with every reason to believe that interest rates will rise back to normal levels in the future when the Fed's QE1, QE2, QE3, QEN policies finally stop, I think it's just a matter of looking ahead a few years. And the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, does look ahead a decade in its scenario, and it says interest rates are likely to rise by the end of this decade from near zero today to maybe 4 or 5 percentage points on short-term debt, and on average high enough to drive the debt servicing from the current level of about 1.5% of GDP up to something like 3.3, 3.4% of GDP early in the 2020s. Now, going up to, say, 3.3, 3.4% of national income in debt servicing is not very attractive to me, because that would mean on the current CBO baseline that we would be spending more on simply servicing the public debt than we'd be spending on the entire sum of civilian discretionary programs for jobs, for education, for infrastructure, for environment, for climate change, for science and technology. And I don't want to do that. And since we all have Excel, we can make these calculations and say we don't have to do that. We should be more restrained on our borrowing so that we don't get into that trap 10 years from now. And I think Paul also, Krugman, has really done a bit of a disservice by saying that the only test is whether we're going to have a financial market panic in the future.
Right. I think that's a bizarro standard for whether it's a good idea or not, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah, because the most basic point
of, it's all free.
Yes, the most basic point of intertemporal public economics is that you have to service your debt in the future. You don't have a Madoff scheme at hand. You don't have a Ponzi scheme at hand. You're going to have to service this stuff. And that's going to require revenues, and those revenues are going to be politically face political resistance. They're going to crowd out other things, and they're going to be distortionary. So just building up debt has a cost. If you're doing an optimal control to your budget, you have a shadow price to building up that debt. And if you do it in a more straightforward way, you have to pay for it. It's not free. And a good metric is that you have to pay for it in present value. And that means taking on $1 of debt, you're going to have to raise $1 of revenues or cut $1 of spending or do some combination of the two in the future. And you better think ahead about that and not be so blithe. Now, of course, there's another voodoo side of this, which is the voodoo left that, in my view, is no less or more meritorious than the voodoo right, which said cut taxes, it pays for itself. Well, the voodoo left says spend more money, it pays for itself. And to my mind, these are both examples of profound wishful thinking that are naive, counter to experience, and invite abuse. And so I don't like them on either side.
Yeah, they're both perpetual motion machines to an extent that promise something that is so deliciously seductive, but doesn't seem to materialize. I just want one last comment on the Keynesian part, and then we're going to have to close, so I want to get some other quick comments from you. You said that the stimulus story, the dials that you can't turn because they're not there. I'm very sympathetic to that view, being a Hayekian. But you said also that the empirical evidence isn't there. I've come to believe that it's very hard to assess the merits of these claims on either side, either the skeptics like my own view or the people who claim that they know what the multiplier is. The CBO can't really measure what the effect of the stimulus is. They admit they can't construct the counterfactual. We certainly are in a different regime of policy and financial sector stability. What's your view on our ability to even understand the connections between the dials or the non-connections and the rest of the economy?
Well, we're operating in a complex system, so it's not hard to see why we can't understand these things with the precision that is sometimes pretended. Second, many people are confused by the frequent CBO reports that says the stimulus has created X million jobs.
Those are lies.
But they don't understand that what that is simply running the CBO model.
Yeah, I know. It's unbelievable.
Not based on any outcomes at all.
I know. I know. No,
at all.
It's maddening when smart people.
It gets quoted so frequently and misunderstood. So I think it's worth bearing in mind. Third, I would turn to the theory. The theory says that temporary tax cuts and transfers shouldn't be expected to have much of an effect. And one of the things that I really disliked about the stimulus, and it's many things that I disliked about it, was that it was overwhelmingly temporary tax cuts and transfer payments, exactly the kind that even in theory you wouldn't expect to have much of an effect, because the theory says, you should smooth that stuff. Getting a payroll tax cut for a year or some kind of income tax cut for a year or two, that's not going to do very much, and it shouldn't do very much for your spending decisions. And so I think on a theoretical basis, I was, very skeptical. I thought the content of this stimulus was what you would expect to come out of a back room of a congressional committee, basically of Democratic Party side of a congressional committee in 6 weeks, which is nothing very sensible for the long term. So that was a third point of my skepticism. Fourth point is, of course, the forecast didn't work. And I think as a Bayesian, I take that as a sign that something's probably wrong in some of the linkages of this standard view.
Agreed.
And what didn't work is the idea that we would be back to low unemployment, small budget deficits, and rapid growth already by 2011, 2012. And so whatever the others say, their forecasts didn't work. And they, of course, respond, well, many other things intervened, and if we hadn't done this, of course, the stimulus worked exactly as we said it would, but other things happened, and that's why we didn't get the full effect. But I think that's not a very persuasive argument, actually.
It's what Nassim Taleb calls the narrative fallacy, and he's right. I just want to apologize. I said that the CBO estimates about the job creations were lies. That's not quite true. They're very honest about the fact that they just took their model and ran it again with the actual numbers of the stimulus amounts is the only difference. But they just took their forecast and reran it with the actual numbers and called that their estimate. The part
that's surprising, though, is how no news outlet, I shouldn't say, the mainstream news just reported that straightforwardly.
That's the lie part.
Stimulus created so many jobs. That's shocking misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I said lies. It's the pundits and news reports that took those as if they were something vaguely scientific. But anyway, to close, how has this very dramatic economic set of events we're talking about, which have probably grown in your appreciation and understanding of them, have probably changed over time and gotten richer. But for many of us, myself particularly, and I'd like to know if it's true for you, these set of events forced us to think very differently about the way we think about economics. Has this changed for you? Are there lessons you've learned from the crisis that you think are central and that you think the profession has yet to learn?
I don't think the profession's in very good shape. And I think, of course, our profession's hard. It's in some ways, actually, although people will object to this, it's harder than natural sciences because we're trying to take aim to understand not only a complex system, but a complex system that is changing over time. Whereas at least a cell biologist is basically looking at the same phenomenon year in, year out, decade in and decade out. And that cell is, while it evolves very slowly, it doesn't evolve at the same rate as the complex global economy. So my feeling is we've got a very hard job to do, and we don't do it well. And I think that this recent few years has exposed these shortcomings more and more. It's led me to the view which I think I had, but I feel more strongly that we really need to focus a lot more of our time and understanding on change, understanding long-term structural change. This is what makes our field hard, actually. If we were really in a stationary economy, meaning that the probability distributions were relatively unchanging over time, we'd figure this out. My view is that what makes this hard is not only the complexity, which makes statistical identification hard and counterfactuals hard and so forth, but what makes this especially hard is that the underpinning, the substrate of the economy is changing over time, so that our equations are never right, because structure is the deepest part of our change over a period of 10 or 20 or 30 years. And if we don't understand that in a more substantive way, the idea that business cycles are just simply overlaid on this and we have a kind of stationary theory of business cycles is also wrong. At least since my interpretation is that we're living in the mix of these two different temporal experiences, the longer term and the short term, overlaid and interacting with each other. And I find I love the field. This is my 41st year in economics. So that's a lot. And I've not regretted one day of choosing this as my life's work. But I wouldn't say that we're at a healthy moment as a profession right now, and we should take some lessons from this and figure out how to take a strong theoretical set of ideas which are very, very good, but don't define the world because they define too many worlds, too many possibilities, and link them more adequately to evidence and a richer set of evidence and a better way to do the empirical work. And I think that this latest episode in broad public view has really exposed a lot of the weaknesses of the profession as it is right now.
My guest today has been Jeffery Sachs. Jeff, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.